my name is Jeremy Kang. I am an Associate Game Design Director at King, and I'm the lead designer in Candy Crush Friends. Again, this is Tracey, this is Robert, and today we're here to present to you our talk, Expanding the World of Candy Crush, a Postmortem on Candy Crush Friends Saga. Over the last 6 years, the Candy Crush franchise has been entertaining players all over the world with its bite-sized brilliance and giving players that sweet feeling of crushing candies, anytime and anywhere. And in the midst of this, we managed to launch a couple of sister titles. We have Candy Crush Soda, we have Candy Crush Jelly, and last year, in October, we launched Candy Crush Friends. It's been a phenomenal 6 years where we managed to reach millions of players with Candy Crush. But when we started thinking about, since we stumbled upon success in 2012, and we started to build a franchise, knowingly or unknowingly, we started thinking about what can we do from here on out that can drive this towards the future, that can make Candy Crush a classic or a long-lasting game franchise, like our heroes, the greats like Mario or like Tetris. So how do we move the franchise forward? And that was when we started making Friends, we were thinking to ourselves, okay, we want to grow. Growth was the key word, but how do we grow the franchise? How do we grow the game? And we wanted to focus on two major areas. The first question was, how do we grow the audience? And the second question that we had was, how do we grow the brand? So let's talk about the audience. What were the opportunities? Over the last 6 years, over 500 million players have played Candy Crush. And 6 years is a very long time in the mobile market. So with Friends, we had the opportunity to not only reach new players, but also remind all these players that have played Candy Crush over the last 6 years why they fell in love with Candy Crush in the first place. So when we look at audience, when we look at how we want to grow, a good place to start was in our own backyard, trying to win this audience back. The other opportunity that we had was, after hundreds of characters over 6 years, with 7 different types of candies, 5 different kinds of power-ups, guess what is the one thing that when you talk about Candy Crush that most people recognize? Does anybody know? It was this thing. It's not any of the characters, it's not any of the other things, it's the chocolate bomb. So we found an icon that allows us to, that was synchronous with Candy Crush. It's a bit like the Mario, it's a bit like the mushroom to Mario, but the thing is that we had the mushroom, but we didn't have a Mario to go with it. So we had this opportunity to do a lot more with the characters that we had. And that's how we landed on the 2 key objectives for Candy Crush Friends. Number 1 was to give players a deeper connection to the candy world and the characters, and number 2 was to re-engage returning players and reach new ones with a more accessible and engaging game. And now, Tracey and Robert will talk to you about how we try to give players a deeper connection to the candy world and the characters.
Thanks, Jeremy. Candy Crush. When the original Candy Crush Saga was released in 2012, no one had any idea how successful it was going to be. As we launched more and more successful games with rich, colorful characters, we faced a really good problem to have. We went from a few fun characters to play with to having more and more and more and more. As Jeremy said, we have hundreds of characters. So how do we make use of this rich game world and give it a cohesive backstory? How do we give our players a deeper connection to the world and its characters, and, as Jeremy said, was one of our key objectives, if there are so many characters? So in the last year or so, the new narrative design team at King, under the leadership of our global narrative director, took on this enormous task of putting together the Candy Universe Bible, which gave us a comprehensive foundation to work with, allowing us to give narrative context to the characters, the gameplay, and the art styles of the Candy games. With this Universe Bible, which we continue to add to and refine every day, we give a foundational narrative structure to all the game teams. It basically it gives a set of general guidelines around the stories that we want to tell and how we want to use these characters. And we're actively trying to put more of these ideas in the game in future updates. One way that we're trying to inject more narrative into the game is through this short cinematic, where we set up the main characters, a little bit about how they ended up in the Candy Kingdom, and what they set off to do with their new abilities and newfound friends.
Aha!
So this is the kind of thing that the Universe Bible can help us do more of. And it also certainly helped us when we were developing the new 3D art style for Friends, which I'll hand over to Robert to talk more about.
Hello, everybody. The creative process of working on Candy Friends was quite a journey. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a metaphorical sense. It was a literal journey. And so if you bear with me, it gets a little complicated here, but I'll try and explain it. Our story begins in the lovely city of Stockholm with an incredible game team, and they did amazing work. They worked really closely with our central art team in Barcelona and London. This is actually the team that I'm a part of, and it's a global team of specialists in visual development, animation, and tech art. We also had really amazing support in visual development and narrative in our very own city, San Francisco. And when it came time to do the cinematics and the high-res marketing images, we relied on a really close collaboration between Stockholm with Brand Creative Studios, Aardman, Nathan Love in New York City, and Central Art. To top it off, we had one really dedicated art director who worked in our Berlin office who traveled to Stockholm on a weekly basis for the better part of a year to support the Stockholm team. And so when you look at this map, it looks crazy, and it's almost a bit of a mess. And we had all of these artists working in different time zones and in different locations, and yet at the same time, it worked for us. And I think part of the reason why it worked so well was because we just had an awesome team who was really dedicated to the values of King, of collaboration, and they also went through and set a really sound set of production principles that guided us through the whole process. So, starting off, when we were looking to evolve the IP and bring Candy into the 3D space, one of the big challenges that we had was how are we going to be able to evolve an IP and at the same time preserve all of the visual themes that were important in the first place. We went through this process by first doing a really deep dig on what was the essence of Candy. And we worked with the original artists in the game, and we sought their advice, and we really tried to isolate these core principles. This resulted in a master style guide that had multiple chapters. We talked about the origins of the franchise. We also talked about character design, environment design, and how the world would work in 3D. One of the most vital parts of this process was setting up these art pillars. And through these art pillars, we were able to see what are the core themes, visual themes of Candy. And really it comes down to that Candy is about nostalgia. And it's the nostalgia of the board games that we used to play as children, the cartoons we woke up early on a Saturday morning to play, and the characters that were on our cereal boxes as kids. It's those shared collective memories that we have that I think really helps power our brand. This is a page from our Origins style guide, and it also shows how deeply influenced Candy, the original Candy artists were by traditional paper puppet theater. And you'll see this also in our characters. I think one of the really great things about Candy is that they took essentially like old, antiquated toys from generations past, and they repurposed them, and they put a modern twist on it. And I think it was particularly valuable for us because the original Candy artists found a really smart workaround to some technological difficulties that they would have had when they first developed it. By having these hinged, articulated puppets, it allowed us to stylize animation in a way that could work for them. On the flip side, when we went to 3D, this created a whole host of problems. If you look at the image on the right, you could say It's a pretty nice drawing. You might even argue that it's a better drawing than the one on the left, but it is not on style. And part of the problem was that we have this articulated puppet style that doesn't quite work in 3D. And when we started bringing characters into 3D, we started noticing that we were losing a little bit of the idiosyncrasy and charm of the original. When we went through this process, we started to evolve it, and we realized that we have these original Candy characters. This is how they appeared in the original, and this is where we landed with our target paintings. If you notice, we tried to keep a lot of the elements of the old. We had those brass joints and all of the kind of puppet quality that we had in the originals, we brought that into the 3D version. I think it's really important that we still have a connection to the past, and even though we have the technology to not put those puppet joints in, we were still heavily influenced by marionettes and puppets, and they made a logical transition as we went into 3D. This is where our final high-res marketing renders landed. We're really happy with where we were able to get with these, and it was a really long and exhaustive process to get here. And I'm going to show a couple images that I think at the heart show how we got there. First and foremost, we made really highly detailed model packets. Candy is a big IP. There are 4 games currently using this IP, and so it made sense for us to invest heavily in making really detailed model packets. These model packets were used with a lot of the kind of tried and true principles of traditional animation. These are principles that have been used for generations in feature animation. And one thing that we look to do is try and have each drawing in our model packets accomplish something. So for instance, when you have this pose sheet of Tiffy, we were looking at how we could show animators and riggers how our characters would move, behave, and perform. Another important factor with the model packets is we tried to ask certain questions, and one of the most important things to me is how can we serve the other artists on the team? To me, really good concept art is about embracing a level of humility and service. And so, for instance, when we look at these turnarounds of Yeti, we were designing these specifically for our 3D character artists, and we wanted to give them a template that could allow them to create their best model. These drawings, they tend to be really tedious, and they're time-consuming, but we encouraged our artists to embrace it and to really not cut corners in this process. When we can solve as many of these problems on paper, it will ease the burden on artists later on in the production pipeline. I love these types of drawings. They're very functional, and they are all about providing visual solutions for movement and construction. And really, at the end of the day, they aren't flashy. They aren't flashy like, say, key art or a target painting, but they're vital and they solve visual problems. At the end of the day, when we sweat those small details, it allows us to push our characters. It allows us to push performance, emotion. And in this case, with Mr. Toffee, we wanted to squash and stretch and move this character around in any way that could enhance performance and give our animators a character that they will really love to have perform. As we were working on the model packets, we also engaged in working on target paintings and shader packets. This was a really vital part of the process because it allowed our artists to have targets to hit in shaders and materials, And one of the core things that we wanted to accomplish with 3D Candy style is that this is a world that's really tangible, that the textures are very tactile, that the candies look delicious, and that the characters have very specific materials. In the end, really, we wanted these characters to look nice, but even more importantly, we wanted to make sure that we could have them move around and perform and emote. And ultimately, if we can accomplish that, we have a better chance of connecting with our players. I'm going to pass this on to Jeremy, and he's going to talk about our other objective.
All right, thank you, Robert. Hey, it's me again, and I'm here to talk to you about our second key objective, which was to re-engage returning players and reach new ones with a more accessible and engaging game. So a good place to start when we talk about our players is talking about our players' motivations. From our studies and what we do in focus groups, we kind of know that the average Candy Crush player plays Candy Crush for many different reasons, to be entertained, for a buzz, to pass time, etc. The average player has 5 or so of these motivations that they identify with, of which the 2 main ones are to be entertained and to relax and unwind. And this was a good starting point for us when we were designing Friends. We were like, okay, so we know that these are the main motivations for our players. How do we entertain them even more? And how do we get them to relax and unwind even more by playing Candy Crush? So that was the starting point, and we started with the core gameplay on this. We went and looked at the core gameplay, and we thought, okay, how do we make this even more entertaining? And somewhere in this, the answer was more explosions. The analogy we had back home in the studio was, if Michael Bay directed a Candy Crush game, this is basically Candy Crush Friends. And that's why you see all the explosions there. So that was one thing that we did. We also did like a greatest hits of game modes. We took a lot of game modes from our sister titles and did new spins on that, but we also introduced a lot of new game modes that's unique to Friends, like the Sweetheart ones, for example. And then we also introduced Candy Surprises. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in my next slides. So that was the good thing about Candy Crush Friends. We also wanted, with a new game in the franchise, to be able to address some of the negative things that came with 6 years of history. So while Candy Crush sits really well, if you look at this scale, on the left there's subconscious autopilot entertainment, and on the right is conscious entertainment. Candy Crush sits a little bit closer to the left, which is really good in helping players escape from real life, to distress and relax. But some of the connotations that came with that was that it was time wasting, or it was mindless after playing the game for a little bit longer. So we wanted to try to address some of these things with a new game. The key word was accessibility, and a good place to start with making the game more accessible to reach new players was difficulty. This was the natural step. You can see from this curve, when we started playtesting the game, or when we started going into soft launch in 2017 in February, we had a much higher difficulty curve than we had a year later in 2018, when we were a lot closer to hard launch. And a lot of this time was spent in the first 80 to 160 levels. Why these numbers? The first 80 levels we considered as our onboarding first-time user experience. Imagine that, an 80-level tutorial. That's basically what we did. And we kept going back to redo the flows until we found the right flow that was accessible to new players and also bring returning players back. But there's only so much you can do with difficulty without having it feel trivial. We still wanted to give players a sufficient level of challenge, so we needed to find something else that could reward the player's time, and it's not just about levels. And that's how the need for Candy Surprises and rewards came about. We wanted to have a central reward system that would reward players with boosters. So 2 principles went into our reward system. One of them was that we wanted to reward for skill. So the more you progress, the faster you progress, the more rewards you would get. But we wanted to also have a philosophy where we rewarded for effort. So just by spending time in the game, by doing grindy quests, or by logging in, you get the surprises as well. So that was one thing that we did. And the other thing that we did was that from this, a need for more permanent rewards became a necessity. We had these characters and these costumes that we came up so that the players had permanent rewards that they could keep. That's just beyond the boosters. And that brings us to our first learning. In soft launch, we learned that the greater accessibility and rewards had the most measurable impact on new and returning players. So we aimed to create a game that was more accessible for new players, and I think to a good extent we succeeded. It's showing strong retention, and it's also showing strong per-player monetization at this phase of the launch relative to the other games. And my hypothesis here is that somewhere in this mix, we managed to create a game that was not only more accessible, but for the more skilled players was a very different player flow and a very different progression model, that they were used to playing the levels a little bit faster, and we rewarded them for playing the levels like faster with Star Chaser, like better, for example, or faster with Mystery Chess. So we have features to complement and to actually reward for skill. The other thing that we did was that we had all this effort, as covered by Robert and Tracey, in putting like the characters at the forefront. So we wanted to have characters at the core of Candy Crush Friends, and this is something that we decided really early on. So we were like, okay, where can we put the characters? Let's put them in core gameplay. Let's have some degree of narrative that we can cover their backstories. Let's put them in live events where we add seasonal costumes and give them a greater degree of relevance. And let's have something around collection where they can collect costumes and customize their characters. A starting point for this was core gameplay. So we had over like 100 characters, right? And then it's like, the first thing was like, we have this whole spread of characters, what can we do? The first leaning that we had was that, what about a puzzle battler, right? So every character has its own ability, you went into a puzzle battler, but this wasn't necessarily the right game for our audience when we tested it, because choices. You have so many choices, and the granularity of choices is so strong across all the different characters and all the different powers that this was moving away from the casual target. So we decided, let's focus on a cast of 10 to 12 principal characters, and let's have them help you out on the levels. And that's where we landed with the screenshot in the middle. But one design that we tried in this phase was that we wanted to add a degree of strategy. So the players had to actually tap the characters of the champions to deploy the power-ups. And what we found out from testing was that, again, choices. Like, having the choice to deploy that, a lot of players were finishing the levels or losing the levels without actually activating the power-ups. And that's when it led us to the final design, where the power-ups are thrown automatically onto the board, so the characters are just helping you out directly. And the other thing that we did to make it more accessible, pro tip, if the character throws a power on the board, normally it goes really close to another power-up. So this is one of the strategies that you can use in the game as well. And this whole thing about finding the right balance between choice and casual was also in everywhere else in the game. We wanted to give players the choice to pass levels to different characters, but every time that we introduced choice, it was complexity, and this is the opposing force of creating a casual game that was streamlined and that players could just get into. Like an example here is that we tested the UI of having 3 different character choices, with and without the recommended label. So you see that the blue banner or the green banner, every time we tested it without the banner, it always tested worse than with. And this brings me to my second lesson, which is user testing was essential in helping us find a fine balance between choice and casual. Because choice, while it's great and introduces depth, does introduce a degree of complexity. And this is almost the opposite of casual. So to find the right balance where we wanted to get the depth, but also to hit a casual audience, we had to do a lot of user testing to figure this out through our playtest, our soft launch, and also with our focus groups. Coming back to what we wanted to do with collection, we wanted to create this economy of permanent rewards that the players get. So we had this model, and we have strong reason to believe through Quantic Foundry's research and our own internal player insights that there is a huge potential for the Candy Crush audience to get behind collection and completion. So we had this model we tried to map out our players' motivations. Most of our players are at the bottom of the pyramid, where what they're interested in is to move from one level to the next. And some of these players will be interested in collection by collecting stuff, and some of these would be really hardcore, I want to collect everything. These are the achievers. The challenge was trying to move as many players from progression to start caring about collection. So we had this pretty early on, and this was actually the App Store screenshots that we had in a very earlier version of the game that we soft launched, where we had the characters helping you out in levels. There was some sort of power crawl meta where you can level them up. And then you had this thing at the side, which is called a village, that you could collect and you can customize the worlds with. And this experimenting with the meta was very much throughout the entire production. We had a meta where we had like rotating islands, board games, the village, and then we also had the story boxes. Particularly the story box is an interesting one to talk about. This was the archive feature that we had, and we tested this about 3 or 4 months before hard launch. On paper, it was a really good idea because it allowed us to not only service collection, but also have like narrative elements. How this works, I'm going to give you a brief overview, is that you play the levels, you collect these candy surprises, and in the surprises you get these coins. The more costumes that you unlock, the more boxes that you would have, and you can use these coins to customize the boxes and get some sort of like story when you finish it. So it shows personality or interactions between the different characters. And again, like I said, like it sounds really good on paper, but when we tested it, we realized, and this was like 3 months before hard launch, and we spent a lot of production effort in this in making it look good, we realized that it tested slightly negative on retention. And that's where it led us to this lesson, where we believe that clear progression goals remain king for our players. What we did here was that we probably introduced one additional parallel track of progression, and this was not always in conjunction with the normal progression track. So the players had 2 different progression tracks, and it could have been a little bit confusing for a lot of players getting back into the game or new players. So instead, with like 3 or 4 months left, what we did was that we spent the production effort instead, put our 3D artists and our modelers behind beautifying the map and putting more love into the things that we know our players like, and this is where we ended up with. So after like months or like years of like production, the final package that we went with was having these 4 pillars, like a more explosive, like polished core gameplay, a more accessible progression envelope or progression meta, 3D characters that will help you out in the levels, and a collection meta that had light customization elements and permanent collectibles. And with that, we launched Candy Crush Friends on October 11th, 2018, in the middle of Manhattan. What you see here is that we had the game projected on a large building in Manhattan, and we broke a Guinness World Record of being the biggest game, like literally the biggest game, because it was like projected on a building, right? And it's been good. Like for the last few months, it's been good. Like the game has hit top of the charts in 93 countries. It's showing really strong on retention and monetization, and we believe that this is going to drive growth, right? Normally, this is where it's happily ever after, but no, not really, because this is the live game, right? And let me talk, and something about a live game is that it's very different from building a live game compared to like a traditional game franchise, where you release a game at a time, and there's a certain linearity to that. While we're releasing Friends, the model looks a little bit more like this, right? So we're doing Friends, and then Candy Crush is building 4,000 levels, Soda is building 3,000 levels, Jelly was approaching 2,000, and then we relaunch Friends. Case in point here is that live games don't really die. They just go on forever. So the things that we need, and this is very much the approach we're taking with Friends, moving forward for the rest of the year. Friends is still very much in launch mode. There's still a lot of work to do, even though we hard launched it, but we still want to keep doing it and keep improving it. And the areas that we want to start looking at, or to keep looking at, is to keep emphasizing on live events. We're going to do more of the characters. We're going to do more live ops on a scale that we've never done before. We're going to try to work on collection even more to make it even more meaningful. And we want to work on social. And this comes from early tests that we did with brand that when players heard Candy Crush Friends, they expected it to be a game with friends. So why not, right? That's where we're going for the year. And we also want to, from a brand perspective, from a franchise perspective, keep investing in the world that we created, to keep improving this, and to keep creating a much more whimsical or fantastical kingdom for our players to escape to, with characters with backstories and narrative elements, so that hopefully in the near future, we can establish a game where there's a deeper connection between the characters and our players. And that's about it. Thank you. Questions? Do we have time?
Hey.
Hi there. I found the talk about all the art assets that you built and how rigorous you were with that part of the build. I found that really fascinating. I'm curious to hear if you have any way of measuring the impact or the time and effort that you put into that, and what effect that had on the retention or the cost of further development. Any kind of metrics around that?
So the question is that with all the effort that we put into the art, whether there was any measurable way that we could measure like the impact of the art, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is it you, is it me?
We could both take it. I'd be happy to jump in.
Yep.
I think a table makes work.
As far as the aspect of how it affected and actual data of how it affected our players, we know that people are interested in the characters and there's a curiosity for them, but we don't actually know necessarily a tangible amount that this made it appreciate more. One thing that I would say is that we put that much work into it as an investment because we look at the possibility of how we can get the full potential of Candy IP. As Jeremy said earlier, a lot of people didn't even know who the characters were, or they would see the main character Tiffy and they would call her Fifi or that little girl or whatever. And so we wanted to make sure that we build the IP and build kind of a foundation there as well.
I'm curious, when you're doing focus group testing, what's the most actionable thing you get out of that, or how do you tell if the game's working? Like, how do you learn lessons from focus groups? Soft launch is easier to look at KPIs, but when you have a really small group in short time, I'm curious what you're looking for.
All right, so the question is, with focus group testing, what do we get out of it? And compared to things like soft launch, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of quant versus qual, right? Like with soft launch, we get to see the numbers for some of the big sweeping changes that we make. With focus group, it's very much around things that we hope to find in terms of of course, UX is one of the major areas, but also motivations, like how players react emotionally to some of the things. For example, when we talk about the archive, were they liking the stories, or were they interacting with it in the right way? Was this something that they would be interested in? And these are the things that normally is a little bit harder to pinpoint when you're doing bigger tests, A/B tests in soft launch. All right, I think we are out of time, but we're going to be in the wash-up room. If anybody else has additional questions, we're going to be around. Thank you for coming down.